Hi, I am Victor Gijsbers and I teach at the Institute for Philosophy of Leiden University in the Netherlands. This is the first video of a course on Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Kritik der reinen Vernunft in the original German, that I will be teaching at Leiden University in the 2021 spring semester. I'm making these videos for my students primarily, but I've decided to put them out here in the wide world where hopefully a lot of people can benefit from them. So this is a bit of an experiment for me. I have released some videos about the philosophy of the humanities earlier on, but I've never tried to release videos for an entire course in precisely this way. So I hope people will enjoy it. I hope people will, react to it. And I hope it will get people to read and maybe even understand or enjoy Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Now, the Critique of Pure Reason has a pretty good claim to being the most influential, most important, best book in the entire history of Western philosophy. Of course, people can disagree with that, and I myself can't claim to have read every book in the history of Western philosophy. But there's really just a couple of contenders for the top spot. Books like Plato's Republic maybe, or Aristotle's Metaphysics. And Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is definitely among them. It has changed the shape of philosophy. It is still today, more than 200 years after its publication, a source of interest, a source of scholarship, one of the most discussed books around. And what I would like to do in these videos is to help you get an understanding of the book, to help you delve into it. So, the critique is not only important and good, it is also very difficult. And that is why it can be helpful to have someone to help you get into the text. That is why it can be helpful to have something like this series of videos. If you try to delve into Kant on your own without any help, it is very likely, even if you have a solid background in philosophy, that you are going to get stuck. Right? Using guidebooks, using courses at the university, or using videos like these is almost necessary for you to open up the text, right? For you to get into the text, understand what's going on, and profit from reading it. So while on the one hand I think that there's absolutely nothing that could substitute for reading Kant's text, and we will be reading Kant's text in this course, at the same time just reading the text without doing anything else is probably not going to allow you to benefit from it the most, or even maybe benefit from it much at all. And that is not just true for students or the general public. That is true for people like me too. Right? When I come to the critique, believe me, I am going to be reading a lot of secondary literature, a lot of other philosophers who have written about the critique, try to understand it and try to explain it. And the same is true when I delve into other famously difficult philosophical texts. I remember that a couple of years ago I tried to read Plato's Parmenides. And if you think that Plato's dialogues are the kinds of things that you take to the beach and sit down and read some fun stories about love, well, try the Parmenides. I was reading it and I thought, okay, without secondary literature, without people helping me understand what is going on here, this is not very profitable. And that's not just true for that text or the critique, it's true across the board, right? Philosophy is not something that we do alone. Philosophy is something that hopefully we can do as a community, where we help each other out, where we help each other to gain more understanding. And so what I hope to do in these videos is help you get more understanding of the first critique. Now, in this first video, I want to say a little bit about what I'm going to do in these videos, in this course. I want to say a little bit more about who I am, but first things first, I want to talk a little bit about who you are. Or rather, what is the kind of audience that I'm making these videos for? Now, if you are one of the students in my Leiden course, then this is obvious, right? You are one of the students in my Leiden course. Great. welcome. I'm really looking forward to seeing all of you in the spring 2021 semester when we will be spending a lot of time talking to each other about the critique. But if you're not one of my students, you know, what kind of background, what kind of knowledge should you bring to this course, right? When is it profitable to you, and when is it going to be like maybe over your head? Well, if this is your first foray into philosophy, I wouldn't be watching this series of videos, because you don't start exploring philosophy by reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, right? It is really difficult. It is really tough. There are many books, including many, you know, really fun primary books written by the great philosophers themselves that are perfect starting points for your exploration into philosophy, like maybe Descartes' Meditations or Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, or something like Plato's Republic. Difficult books, but books that you can sort of read with some profit if you don't have much of a background in philosophy. I don't think the Critique of Pure Reason is among those books. This is technical, this is tough, this is not the starting point. If you don't know about philosophers like Descartes, Leibniz, Locke, Hume, if those kinds of names are not familiar to you, or if you've never heard about things like empiricism and rationalism, or a priori and a posteriori knowledge, then this is probably not the right course for you, and you're just better off starting somewhere else and maybe coming back to this in a couple of years. So just to give you an idea of that, my Leiden students will have at least 1.5 and sometimes 2 or 3 years of philosophy behind them before they start this course. Now, having said that, I would like to emphasize that actually the most important thing, right, the most important requirement for getting any benefit from these videos is just that you're willing to do the work, right? We're going to read the critique, and we're going to read some secondary sources too, and if you're not willing to do that, you're not going to get much out of it. But if you are willing to do that, sit down with the text, even when it's difficult, work through it, you know, I think you can learn something and hopefully benefit from what I'm doing here. So that's the most important thing. And then, of course, finally, I mean, I have no control over whether you can watch this or not. Do whatever you want. This is just your warning. Okay, so that's who this course is for, right? It's good if you have some background in philosophy, because it's a tough text, and we won't be like making it easy. We'll be delving into the difficulties. We'll be delving into like the details of the text and into the most fundamental philosophical problems that the text poses or raises in order to get to the bottom of them. Next, who am I? Well, as I said in the very first seconds of this video, I am Victor Gijsbers. And I work at Leiden University in the Netherlands at the Institute for Philosophy. So I'm Dutch. I studied originally at Utrecht University physics and philosophy. I went on to do a PhD in philosophy, writing about scientific explanation and scientific understanding. And ever since, I've been working in contemporary topics, right? So if you look at my publications, they will be about contemporary philosophy of science, metaphysics, epistemology, you know, questions about what the world is like, what is causation, what is understanding, what is time. Those are some of the topics that really interest me. Now, one thing that should be apparent from what I just said is that I am not really a Kant scholar. Right? I dabble in the history of philosophy. I love the history of philosophy, but I'm not really a specialist in the history of philosophy. I don't write articles about Kant. I haven't read nearly as much Kant and nearly as much about Kant as a real Kant scholar. Nevertheless, I'm teaching, for the second time, a course about Kant's first critique. Like the Critique of Pure Reason is Kant's first critique. And I'll say more about that in a later video. Because there's also a second and a third critique. So, why? Why is somebody who is, you know, working in contemporary topics teaching a course on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason? Well, one reason might be that, I believe that students ought to be able to read the Critique of Pure Reason and, get access to that. And that is true. But maybe more importantly is the fact that I am like really super excited about the critique. I've read it a couple of times, I taught it once, and I am really looking forward to teaching it again. I think it is an amazing work. I think it's an exciting work. I think Kant is right about certain things, but I'm not quite sure which things and in what sense he is right, and I want to know that because I think that Kant can really help us out with the kind of problems that I am struggling with in my own thinking about time and space and causation and stuff like that. And I think the Critique of Pure Reason is just so inspiring in its incredible sophistication. Right? Kant is so good. He is way beyond what most of us are doing in terms of how deeply he thinks, how far he sees, how radical the questions are that he dares to ask. Reading the Critique of Pure Reason, I think, for a philosopher, it is just good for your soul, right? It is brilliant, it's fascinating, it's amazing, and I'm excited, and I hope I can bring across some of that excitement to you too. So, what we're going to do is we're going to delve into Kant, we're going to delve into some secondary literature. I especially am going to delve into some secondary literature as I prepare for these videos, and that is something I just look forward to. Now, not being a Kant scholar, now and then maybe I'll say something that is just wrong. Who knows, maybe I'll even get corrected. That is great, right? This is a journey of discovery, not just for you, but also for me. And if I learn something along the way, and if I have to rethink certain things along the way, that is absolutely fine with me. Finally, what I can say about that is, I am passionate about the critique. And who said that the most important thing in ethical behavior is being passionate? Definitely not Kant. Right? That is the last thing Kant would say. This is not a course on Kant's practical philosophy, on his ethics as such, but we'll probably be bumping into that time and time again. Because for Kant, the relation between theoretical and practical reason is very important. So we'll talk about that. Okay, now what are we going to do in this course? Well, clearly we're going to read the Critique of Pure Reason. We're not going to read the entire critique probably, but we're going to read a significant part of the Critique of Pure Reason. And the text that I will be using is this one. It is the Cambridge edition of the works of Immanuel Kant, the English translation by Paul Geyer and Alan W. Wood. So that is the version of the critique that I will be citing in my videos. And it can be helpful if you have the same version, but you don't have to. In fact, what I recommend to my students is to read a version of the critique in a language that they are comfortable with. Right? If you are comfortable with English, this is a fine choice, and there are other fine choices. If you're comfortable with German, I mean read the original. If you're comfortable with Dutch or French or Spanish or whatever, read a good translation in that language. That's fine. Right? That's fine. And probably you'll be able to understand what the terminology, how the terminology that I'm using maps onto the terminology of your version. I don't think that's going to be a great problem. Now, here's one thing that is important. Like whatever edition of the critique you're going to use, it has to be an edition that contains both the A and the B version of the critique. An A and a B version, what am I talking about? Well, Kant published the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, and that is the first edition, or the A version. And then he published a reworked edition of the critique a couple of years later, and that is the second edition, which is known as the B edition, or the B version. And any good translation of the critique is going to have both the A version and the B version in it, because there are significant differences, right? Big parts are just entirely the same, or maybe can't change the word here and there, but there are also sections of the critique, including its most baffling and maybe most important section, the transcendental deduction, which are just completely rewritten for the B version. And so you really need both access to both the A and the B version. Now, in any good edition of the critique, you are going to find at one place or another these A and B page numbers. So for instance, if you look carefully here, and I think you ought to be able to see that, you can see an A and a B number in the margin. Right? That is the page numbers of the first edition and the page numbers of the second edition. And we generally cite the critique by saying, well, Kant says at A37, B54, right, A37, B54, that is, you know, here a paragraph in the critique. This and this and this, right? That's the way that we refer to the critique. And so if it's a passage that appears in both the A and the B version, we will say A this, B that. If it's a part that appears only in the A or the B edition, then we will just say A such and such or B such and such, right? And so that's important to have that, right? It's important to have an edition that has those page numbers in them, because otherwise you won't be able to look up any references to the critique. Okay, so that's that. We will be reading especially the first half of the critique, a little bit of the second half of the critique. I'll say more about that when I get to the table of contents in a later video. Maybe I will continue making videos after the course and go on to talk about the parts that we didn't talk about in the course, but I'm not sure about that yet, so no promises on that front. Now, I've taught my students in the course, in the Leiden course, to not just buy a version of the Critique of Pure Reason, but also get this guidebook. So this is Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason by Sebastian Gardner. And that is definitely not the only guidebook to the critique, but I think it's very helpful. It's pretty accessible. It covers basically the entire critique. And so I will be asking my students to read through that as we work through the critique. And I'll probably be giving them some secondary literature as well. And whenever I ask students to read something, I'll make a mention of that also in the description of the video. So if you're following this course outside of the Leiden framework, you'll be able to read along with us. Possibly some of the secondary literature is going to be like behind terrible academic paywalls, and that's something that I can't really do anything about, right? If you don't have access to a university, there might be some texts that I'm going to be using, like some articles that I'm going to be using that are hard to access. I'm sorry about that, and let's just hope that we all move to open access really, really quickly. So, if you have other books about the critique, other things that can help you, use them, why not, right? I'm not limiting your reading, I'm just suggesting some stuff for you to read. So finally, maybe in this first video, I should say something about my approach to the Critique of Pure Reason. I think if you have a historical text like that, there's a bunch of ways that you could try to approach it. One we could call the interpreter's approach, right? We try to interpret the text. What is Kant actually saying? What does Kant mean? What is going on here in the text, right? Really taking the text as a central item, the thing that we try to understand. We could also take something that maybe could be called the historian's approach, where we say, look, what I want to know is how does Kant fit into his historical context? Who has he read? What is he reacting to? That's interesting. A third approach, which, I don't know, maybe we could call the specialist's approach or something like that, would be one where we say, hey, what I'm really interested in is the kind of debates about Kant and about the Critique of Pure Reason that are being held in the secondary literature right now. I mean, what are Kant scholars right now interested in talking about? What are the big debates going on? A fourth approach, which maybe we can call the judge's approach, is we read the book asking the question, well, but is Kant right? Or is he wrong? Right? And where is he right? And where is he wrong? And finally, we could try to, I don't know, the inspired approach or the inspirational approach or something like that, we could read Kant with the aim of being inspired by him, right? We want to find things in Kant that we can use in our own work. So, I just listed 5 approaches, right? A sort of textual, interpretative approach, a historical approach, an approach focusing on the secondary literature, an approach that wants to know whether Kant is right or wrong, and an approach that tries to get ideas from Kant to use in our own thinking. I think all of those approaches are connected to each other, right? You can't really say, oh, I'm going to do one of them and ignore the others, right? As if you could interpret the text without knowing about the historical context, or without knowing about the debates in the secondary literature, or without thinking about whether what Kant says makes any sense, right? And to give you just one example of that, there's a famous passage in a book on Kant by Strawson, where Strawson accuses Kant of making a mistake in his reasoning, which he calls a non sequitur. So that is a logical mistake, a non sequitur of numbing grossness, right? So Kant is like totally wrong. He is so wrong in his reasoning there, according to Strawson. Well, if that's your judgment about a passage in Kant, well, in any text, but in Kant in this case, that's a pretty good reason of wondering whether your interpretation is right. Right? Maybe your interpretation is wrong. Maybe Kant doesn't say what you thought he was saying, or doesn't say it in the way that you thought he was saying it, or something like that. And finally, you know, if we don't take the time to really understand Kant, then any ideas we're going to get from him are probably not as interesting as the ideas we get when we do take the time to really interpret Kant. So I think that all of these approaches are connected to each other. If I had to tell you what I'm going to emphasize, I would say I'm going to emphasize the first, like reading the text, trying to understand the text, but you're probably going to see all of these things pop up now and again because they just are connected. And my own interest in the critique is pretty broad, right? I want to understand Kant, but I also want to use him. I also want to know what is right about it, and so on and so forth. So once again, I'm very excited about this course. I hope you're excited about it too, and I hope we'll be talking to each other a lot more. If you're my student in Leiden, then I hope I will be talking to you in a very literal way. If you're not, then it's going to be kind of one-sided, me talking and you listening, but nevertheless, I hope you enjoy it. Thanks.